And that's where a lot of the policies we hopefully will see is moving to. There are lots of emotional feelings. I've just listed a few here. You have a person with dementia, and I mentioned very sort of flippantly in passing that there's a stigmatization almost. So, oh, my husband's becoming a bit forgetful. We don't like to use the D word is as bad as the C word. We don't talk about cancer, we don't talk about dementia. And every family member who is in the network around the person with dementia has to deal with that in their own way, and they will tackle it very differently. Some withdraw, some feel embarrassed, they feel ashamed that someone has dementia. These are the stigmas, and these are the stigmas that come from the past, when any sort of abnormality, we locked it away. We locked it away. I remember the first time I came to Brazil, which is over 20 years ago, and families were locking up people with mental problems. And when I say locking them up, they locked them in a room in the house. And we still, in a way, we're still living with the legacy of that sort of attitude to abnormality. Dementia is seen as abnormal, and therefore there's a stigma. And probably that's one of the biggest issues that we have to face. As I've just mentioned, life is put on hold. They focus on the dementia sufferer, which is understandable, and then they have little or no time for themselves. Okay. The spouse is normally the main provider, and if the spouse is unable to cope, then it will typically be the daughter, perhaps the daughter-in-law in some cultures. And as I've already touched upon, it's a very traumatic experience seeing a loved one change so dramatically because of dementia. That person becomes a stranger. It's not the person that you knew before. But they wouldn't give it up. It may be difficult, and it may be traumatic, but they want to carry on doing it. This is this familial obligation that we have. And despite all the odds and despite all the problems, we want to carry on doing it. I mentioned that you might have to stop working, and therefore taking on a caring responsibility could mean that your standard of living plummets because you no longer go to work. And if you're lucky, if you live in a country which provides carer support, you would get some financial assistance. If you live in a country, and most countries in the world don't provide carer support, then you get by as best you can. Or you try and continue working at the same time as caring. And that is then a double jeopardy, a double whammy. Huge levels of stress are seen in studies where carers have been researched. Huge levels of stress. Just trying to tackle everyday life. So they become very vulnerable. Life is on hold, so leisure time and social life disappear. And even if they can get help from public services, they may have to also pay for some of those, depending again in which country they find themselves. So it is a huge burden on these families. I mentioned too that the community has to address dementia. Okay. And I'll just run through quickly what the community has to do. It has to enable the family, because remember the family wants to do this. And I think families should therefore be allowed to do it, but they then should not suffer. It may be very, very practical support in the home to the dementia sufferer. It can be practical help. Maybe there are some things that need to be done in the house to make it more livable. But in many instances, it's guidance. It's knowing that when my husband starts talking to me as if I'm a complete stranger, then that's a very normal behaviour in a person with dementia. There's nothing unusual about that. But family carers typically are very under-resourced in terms of knowledge, but also guidance in how we should behave with someone with dementia. So, my mother, who died just 6 months ago, didn't have dementia, but she was very old. She was 92. She couldn't remember things. So sometimes she would talk to me about someone from her past life who hadn't been to see her for a long time. Now, should I say to Mum, well, of course he's not been to see you. He's been dead for 20 years. Or should I say, I'm sure he's busy and he'll come to see you when he's got time. The new research would indicate it's the latter, that we should actually put ourselves into the world of the person who's suffering from dementia. So rather than trying to correct them all the time, we should actually, in a way, go along with their story. And I experienced it very acutely with my mother, because both of her sisters died within about 6 months of one another. And when it happened, she was fine, she was upset, but she moved on. But then she forgot, of course, that they died. And it took me a long while to realise that whenever we were talking about that, I was making life really unpleasant for my mother, because she was reliving their death every single time she mentioned it. And I said to them, "Oh, but Mum, they're dead." "What?" she'd say. And she'd relive the death again, until I eventually read about this new research and realised I had to live into the life that my mother had in her head. I just said, "Oh, they'll probably be coming next week." Because that's all she needed to know. Okay. But it is all about providing enabling environments, enabling them to live a full life. There's something called Streets for Life. This is an emerging concept. Those of you who might be interested in design, this is a huge new concept. Remember when I started talking, I talked about everything out there is about young people. When I say young, I mean under 50-ish. I don't mean under 25. Okay, everything out there is about them. The Streets for Life idea is, how do we design our communities, our public spaces, our public buildings, so that they enable us at any age, at any stage of our life, with whatever disability we may have, how do we design those environments to enable me to have a full life at any age? This is a massively emerging area of research, and it's also being put into practice. And in Oxford, we work very closely with the Royal College of Art in London, who are one of the key players in the world in working in these Streets for Life ideas. Okay. It has to be put into a sustainable community, which is all about whether we can afford and whether it's good for climate change, etc. We need age-friendly neighbourhoods. WHO has an age-friendly city initiative. And if I was going to be very cynical, which I very often am, I would say it's just nice reports with lots of things people should do, and not always good things that help everyone. So, for example, I don't know whether I've come across them in Mexico, actually, but on pavements at dangerous spots where you cross the road or where there's a step up or a step, you have in the pavement little bumps. Do you have those in Mexico? No. Some people are nodding. You obviously, whoever said no lives in the wrong place. I don't know whether you have them, but it's certainly in the UK we have them. So that therefore people who are visually impaired So as they're walking along, either with their feet or with a stick, they feel these little bumps on the steps. And they know, here is something I need to be careful of. It's wonderful for people who are visually impaired. However, if you have a false leg, they are really painful to walk on. So you've solved a problem for one group, and you created a new problem, unintentionally, for another group. And we do need to look into all of this in designing our neighbourhoods. Also the design of our homes that we need to think about. Particularly what's coming in there, of course, is this whole new area of what is called assistive technologies, robotics, and the clever home that pretty much does everything for you. And we're only at the beginning of research into how that can be developed and how that can be used, not just for dementia sufferers, because when we're talking about age-friendly, again, we're talking about everybody. It should be inclusive. Then the final one is this one about climate change, and of course, as our cities become increasingly difficult to live in, the most vulnerable people in our populations will unfortunately be the ones who are unable to move from those cities, and therefore they will be left in these increasingly hostile urban environments where actually living will be pretty much impossible in the future unless, even on the climate change trajectory that we're on now, and if it doesn't get worse, then our cities are going to be almost impossible to live in. What makes a place comfortable? Well, there are lots of things, and I've listed some of them here. Some of them you can do something about, some of them you can't. But is it clean? Is it quiet? Noisy? Calm? What about the signs that enable us to find our way around? Can we cross streets? What about public transport? Is it all of these things out there that make life easy? And if they're not there, they make life really difficult if you do have a disability. Okay, we don't mind having to find a parking space and then walk 500 metres, but if you've got a disability, that can be a huge issue. So all of this is designed, and really just summing it up in trying to make these places inclusive, our environments out there inclusive and friendly for everyone. Where do they live? Well, they actually live in houses just like you and me. They are not locked away in special institutions. They are out there in that normal public domain. And what about the professionals? Surprisingly, a lot of professionals, general practitioners, they're the doctor we would go to if we are in the UK, the local doctor. Surprisingly, many of these professionals are equally unprepared when they meet someone with dementia. So their own training hasn't actually equipped them with the skills to be able to even recognise that maybe this person needs to go for a formal diagnosis. And only after a formal diagnosis will they be able to get access to various support services. And therefore they may spend a long, long time trying lots of different things before actually a person is sent for a formal diagnosis. This is about fragmented, incomprehensible, unapproachable, big words. Basically what it's saying is the system, which is out there to help us, can sometimes be very difficult to navigate. It's not helpful. In fact, it makes it much more difficult than it needs. So I'm going to close with this, because I won't talk about the UK, because I know that